Tell me a bit about your dad.
Yep, he joined the army technically a year before he should have done. The story was he went into the recruiting office, wrote down all the bits of paper, put down his date of birth, and the gentleman behind the counter said, "No, that's wrong, you're too young." He said, "Go outside, come back in again, and then tell me what your date of birth is again." So he came back in and gave his date of birth as a year earlier. So I think you'll find his birth certificate says 1 year, his army certificate says a year earlier. So he joined earlier because he didn't have a very nice home life. And went into the army, went through training, didn't go to France because he was ill and had to go into hospital, a new one they were just building, to take the injured when they came back from France. They kept him there for a while to train the nurses, and when he came out, he was sent to Malaya. And that's when he was captured by the Japanese and was unfortunately taken to the Burma Railroad, of which he suffered terribly. Didn't say a lot, would not talk about it very much. The only stories he really ever told me was going around the camps every day, just carting the dead bodies out and disposing of them. And as my father used to love to make things, he made a working clock out of tin cans, and he also made a model boat out of tin cans that the Japanese officer wanted to take off him, and he didn't let him have it. He broke it up and was nearly shot if it wasn't for a senior army man come up, British army man come up and managed to persuade the Japanese officer not to shoot him. Basically that's all he really said about Burma on the railroad, because it was just so bad. When he came out, when they were released from the railroad and was coming home, they actually went on a world cruise for 6 months on these ships because they were so malnourished. He weighed 7 stone when he went on the ship. When he came off the ship, he weighed 13 because they didn't allow him to come back, or didn't allow them to come back into the country in the state they were in. Then he was on the reservist list, and basically on the reservist list had a few weeks to go before he would have been demobbed. Somebody else in Heacham was ill, so they called him up. I was only 2 months old, and off he goes to Korea and went to what they call the Battle of the Imogen River, of which there is a story about, and essentially got caught by the Chinese and was another prisoner of war now for another 3 years. He didn't come home until 1953. Mother didn't know whether he was alive or dead for well over a year. He was just classed as missing, and she virtually got a phone call, or somebody who didn't even have a phone in them days, somebody came round and said, "Your husband's coming home on virtually the next train." So he came home in 53, and while he was out being a prisoner with the Chinese, that was a completely different story. The British had a relatively easy time of it, and he was on this little island with just a few others, and all the prisoners were dotted on these little islands all over the place. And he said it was just run by like the old Chinese Home Guard and a Korean trainee as such. So they had a relatively easy life, but nobody knew they were there, and they weren't really discovered until one of the prisoners feigned an illness and got took to the mainland, and that's where he found out that the war was virtually over. And then the next thing they know, there's an American plane comes flying over and dropped some parachutes with goodies, cigarettes and chocolate. And one story he said was they dropped this parachute down, and the next thing they hear is this shouting, and they run over to find this old Chinese man in a bowler hat with an umbrella, whereas this parachute had dropped into the water, and there he was hanging onto the parachute for life or death because it contained chocolate and cigarettes, and hauled this in, and just so he could have some of the rations as well as they did. And that was basically it. The war was over, and they came back from Korea in, as I say, '53. And but from there he didn't talk a lot about the war, and he spent many hours in his shed just making models and things. He worked obviously, but all his leisure hours were just, most of them were spent in his shed making things. And because he had spent so long in the army, he was also fairly institutionalised. When he left the army, he joined the territorials. When he was too old for the territorials, he ran the local cadet group. When that finished, he then ran to scout troops. So he was always had to be people around him, and that was it, like that, and an organised group.